Mar Tov, everyone. I don't have to tell you things are bad. Everybody knows things are bad. It's a depression. Everybody is out of work or scared of losing their job. The dollar buys a nickel's worth. Banks are going bust. Shopkeepers keep a gun under their counter. Punks running around wild in the street. And there's nobody anywhere who seems to know what to do. There's no end to it. We know the air is unfit to breathe, and our food is unfit to eat. And we sit watching our TVs while some local newscaster tells us that today we've had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be. We know things are bad, worse than bad. They're crazy. It's like everything everywhere is going crazy, so we don't go out anymore. We sit in the house, and slowly the world we're living in is getting smaller, and all we say is, please, at least leave us alone in our living rooms. Let me have my toaster and my TV and my steel-belted radials, and I won't say anything, just leave us alone. Well, I'm not gonna leave you alone. I want you to get mad. I don't want you to protest. I don't want you to riot. I don't want you to write your congressman because I wouldn't know what to tell you to write. All I know is that first, you've got to get mad. You've got to say, I'm a human being. My life has value. I want you to get up right now. Sit up and go to your windows, open them and stick your head and yell, I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore. Things have got to change. But first, you've got to get mad. You've got to say, I'm as mad as hell and I'm not going to take this anymore. Then we'll figure out what to do about it. For all you movie buffs out there, you will recognize that very poor rendition, there's a reason I'm a rabbi and not an actor, from the 1976 movie Network. That famous scene was delivered by Peter Finch on the silver screen more than 4 decades ago. And with the exception of a few minor anachronisms like steel-belted radials, it rings just as true today. There are many people who are saying the same thing. It's time to get mad. It's time to make change happen, and there are times when anger becomes the catalyst for change. It motivates us. It moves us to break out of our routines. There are other times, as we've seen in recent years, when anger fans the flames of hate and suspicion, when it breaks the bonds of humanity and destroys the very things that we hold most dear. These last few years have brought out anger in just about every corner of our society. It is the immediate and go-to emotion that people feel on a daily basis, and it is exhausting us. There is no way that we can sustain this level of anger and accomplish any of the change that anger is impelling us to do, nor is there any way that we can sustain this level of anger and survive as a society. This Yom Kippur, we will look at some of our most challenging emotions. Tonight, I will speak about the proper place for anger. Tomorrow, Rabbi Ern will speak about grief. After this year like no other, our only hope for a new year of positive change is to address these emotions, learn what they can teach us, and use them in a healthy way to move forward. I have shared before that our emotions can be divided into 4 large categories: sad, glad, mad, and afraid. And certainly there are gradations and nuances for each of them, but ultimately our feelings fall into one of those major divisions. Frustration is just a really nice way of saying that we're mad. Contentment is being glad. Feeling anxiety is fear. When we understand the core of what we are feeling on its most basic level, it enables us to begin to manage that feeling and move forward. Anger is one of the most visceral and volatile emotions we have. It often seems to arrive suddenly and can stay around for a very, very long time. Like any powerful emotion, it can quickly change our mindset and our outlook, shifting us from our logical and rational thought processes. And yet, without anger, there would be no change of the things in this world that so desperately need it. Without anger, we would just meekly accept inequity and injustice. We would allow the powerful to prey on the weak, and we would have no motivation to effect the tikkun which I discussed on Rosh Hashanah. As far back as human beings have been attempting to understand the ways of the universe, we have worked to understand anger. In Book 2 of Aristotle's Rhetoric from 350 BCE, he devotes a significant effort trying to outline it. And he defines anger as an impulse accompanied by pain to a conspicuous revenge for a conspicuous slight, directed without justification towards what concerns oneself or towards what concerns one's friends. For him, anger is about revenge for an insult or an affront. And he goes on to say that there's even a path for friends to become enemies because of it. American philosopher Martha Nussbaum, in her book Anger and Forgiveness, talks about how anger is an unusually complex emotion, since it involves both pain and pleasure, because the prospect of retribution is pleasant. As difficult as anger is to control, we often lean into it because it makes us feel better. It masks the pain, much like an anesthetic, and allows us to focus on feeling powerful instead of powerless. She charts the path that anger often takes. It begins with the protection of our dignity and self-respect. We've been injured. We must respond. Next, we recognize that our anger forces us to take the wrongdoer seriously. We do not disregard them or treat them like a child that has no power. They're real, and they've hurt us, so we respond. We realize also that anger is an essential part of combating injustice in our lives and in the world around us. We feel not only anger at our own powerlessness, but we also can feel it for others who suffer it. However, she argues, we finally see that it is most often turned into our own internal means of revenge that accomplishes little other than damaging ourselves and others around us. Up to a point, anger is a useful tool, but it has its destructive downside. Throughout the centuries, our own tradition speaks of anger, and the rabbis struggle to make sense of the benefits and detriments of this emotion. In the Talmud, we find the opinion of Reish Lakish, who says, any person who becomes angry, if he is a Torah scholar, his wisdom departs from him. If he is a prophet, his prophecy departs from him. We also hear from Bar Kapara, who says, an angry person has managed to acquire only anger. The commentaries explain that when someone descends into anger, ultimately, that's all they have left. Finally, we hear from Rabbi Bar Rav Huna, who said, anyone who gets angry, at that moment, even the divine presence is not important to him. And the later rabbis take up a similar position. In the anonymous work from the late 13th century called Sefer HaYashar, the Book of Righteousness, we read that anger is one of the evil qualities which can destroy the worship of God. For the worship of God cannot dwell in the heart of one who is wrathful. At the time of his anger, he pays no attention to anything he does, but instead he multiplies oaths, profanes the name of heaven, kills his friend and harms his companion. Therefore, a man ought not to trust his worship of God if he cannot subdue his wrath. Even today, we see the same caution. In 2017, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs wrote in his commentary to Parshat Hukat, "The verdict of Judaism is simple. Either we defeat anger, or anger will defeat us." There's little doubt from these sources that much of our tradition views anger and rage as something to be avoided and contested. It takes us away from what we're supposed to do here. It distances us from the divine. But we also know how difficult of a challenge that can be. We all struggle with anger at times in our lives. For some, it is a constant battle to not allow our fuse to be lit, and when it is, to try and keep ourselves from exploding and hurting the people around us. Even Moses struggled with anger. It was anger at the taskmaster that provoked him to attack in defense of the Jewish slave. Enraged, he broke God's tablets when he came down the mountain and saw the Israelites worshiping the golden calf. His temper was also what ultimately kept him out of the land of Israel. As we read in yesterday's Torah portion, "You shall die on the mountain that you are about to ascend, for you broke faith with me among the Israelite people at the waters of Meribat Kadesh." It was there that Moses, angered at the people for their constant complaining, struck the rock instead of speaking to it as God had commanded. If even Moses was challenged by this emotion, it should come as no surprise that for all the desires of the rabbis to avoid it, it may in fact be unavoidable. As we think about anger on this Yom Kippur, we recognize yet another challenge that it brings us. Today, we strive for forgiveness, both of those who have wronged us as well as of ourselves. Anger is an obstacle to forgiveness. It locks us into the past and does not allow us to move forward. Nussbaum writes, "Anger diverts one's thoughts from the real problem to something in the past that cannot be changed. It impedes useful introspection. It becomes its own project, displacing or forestalling other useful projects. And importantly, it almost always makes the relationship with the other person worse." In other words, we get so caught in our anger that we cannot move past it and do the work that we're supposed to be doing on these high holy days. So the question becomes, why do we get angry if there are so many pitfalls? I began by sharing that anger can serve a positive purpose as well. Where does that fit into our Jewish world view if all the rabbis speak so harshly against it? Well, there are many theories as to why people get angry, and they all point to the benefit that anger provides. On the surface, it's simple catharsis, a way to vent the fear, grief, loss, frustration, and hurt we accumulate in our day-to-day lives. By letting it out, it relieves the pressure and potentially allows us to manage it better in smaller doses. From a psychological perspective, Dr. Alex Lickerman writes in Psychology Today that he believes there are 4 main reasons that people get angry, and they all provide a benefit of some sort. The first is actually to do harm to oneself. It's a way to feel good by punishing ourselves for our perceived failures. He argues that feelings of powerlessness and depression can often bring an anger directed inward. For me, this is one of the most insidious and challenging types of anger to deal with because much of it is hidden from the outside world, at least at the beginning. It's a conversation that happens in a person's mind and in their soul, and by the time those on the outside realize it, it has created a tremendous amount of damage. The second reason we get angry is to achieve control. We want things to go differently, whether from fear or from annoyance. And so we often will use anger to intimidate or manipulate others into acting differently so we can get what we want. Similar to that is using anger to feel powerful. When we start to feel small, we can sometimes make ourselves feel bigger by getting others to feel that way instead of us. Finally, Lickerman talks about becoming angry to fight injustice. It is, he says, righteous indignation coming from a person's moral center. This resonates with many of us who want to be involved in the tikkun I spoke about, who understand that we cannot deny our responsibility to the world and people around us. And yet, how does this jive with the Jewish sources that seem so clearly to try and keep us away from anger almost at all costs? My friends, we take our guidance on how to behave from many sources: our biblical ancestors, our prophets, our rabbis. But there is one source that we see as the paradigm that we should emulate, and that is God, God's self. The Talmud in Sota asks, what is the meaning of the verse, "Follow none but the Lord your God"? Is it possible for a human being to actually follow the ways of God? What it means is that we should imitate the attributes of God. God is the ultimate exemplar of how we should behave. And while there are certainly times that we can question even God's behavior, I believe in this case we have something that can truly help us understand what is expected of us. There are many occasions in our text that God becomes angry, even punitive. It would not only be foolish but unwarranted to say that anger has no place. On the contrary, as we look at God's conduct, we find that consequences for our own behavior often provoke an angry response. And yet God is described in our Torah and in our High Holy Day liturgy that we're going to hear shortly, not as without anger, rather as erech apayim, slow to anger. Our tradition does not tell us to never be angry. On the contrary, even God gets angry. Rather, our tradition cautions us to be judicious in the use of our anger. There are certainly times when removing a screw or a bolt, one needs to drill it out because it is so rusted in place that that's the only solution. However, not every situation calls for such a drastic action. Perhaps it may be wise to try it with a wrench and some WD-40 first. Too often, the anger that we feel is not a productive kind that motivates or even warns others around us that something is wrong. It becomes uncontrolled and uncontrollable. And very quickly it becomes the focus instead of the tool. Anger has its place, but it should be one of moderated and increasing intensity as the situation calls for it, a last resort, not a first response. Even more than that, often the biggest challenge we have is letting go after it has served its purpose. When we feel the anger rising, we must listen to its call, but not allow ourselves to be consumed by it or the bitterness that unresolved and unreleased anger brings. To quote Maya Angelou, you should be angry, but you must not be bitter. Bitterness is like cancer. It eats upon the host. It doesn't do anything to the object of its displeasure. So use that anger. You write it, you paint it, you dance it, you march it, you vote it, you do everything about it. My friends, use it. Don't let it use you. During the month of Elul, one of the Spiritual Sparks videos focused on the value of being slow to anger. And the Musar teachings that I shared from Alan Marinis's book, With Heart in Mind, helped us focus not on its elimination, but on gaining some control over it, so we can use it as a warning and then act with thought as well as passion. He shared the wisdom of two Hasidic masters. The Alter of Kelm, in order to help himself deal with his anger, made a resolution to never get angry unless he put on his special anger clothes. Only then would he allow his anger to come out. Another master used to give out holy water that he would guarantee to eliminate all domestic conflict. Whenever a couple had the urge to argue, they would put some of this special water inside their mouth and hold it there for as long as possible without swallowing. It proved to be very effective in stopping arguments. Anger is a part of the human experience. We are not asked to live in this world without it. Rather, we're expected to listen to it, move through it, and to use it to fix what is broken and unjust. It is understandable that so many people are angry right now. There's a great deal of brokenness that needs fixing. And each of us needs to find our own way of capturing our raw emotion. And by taking the time to sleep on it, count to 10, reframe the situation, and reminding ourselves to take a simple deep breath before we continue, direct the chaos and turn it into something that is a force for change. The warning klaxon of anger has sounded loud and clear, telling us that we need to act. Yet how we use that anger and put it to positive use will define our character and our future. In Eruvin, Rabbi Eli teaches in three matters, a person's true character is revealed. In his cup, that is, his behavior when he drinks. In his pocket, that is, his behavior in his financial dealings with other people. And in his anger. How we manage our anger and how we hear the anger of others will not only define our own character, but the character of our society as well. Anger is a tool on our tool belt, along with gratitude and generosity, perspective and perseverance. May we wield it with wisdom and intention. May we be reminded this Yom Kippur as we cry out, Adonai, Adonai, merciful God who is slow to anger, that we too must slow our burn and find a way to turn our passion into purpose. Through understanding the balance of disruption and legacy, the need to reject denial and accept responsibility, and the proper use of anger as a tool and not an end, we will create a world of justice and equity, a world of caring and empathy, and a world that embraces atonement and forgiveness. Gmar Chatima Tova.